Hello, magical people of the internet. I'm Jen, and welcome to my vlog. I never thought I would, where we discuss doing things we never thought we would do and the fantastic places that they can lead us. I have such a wonderful guest today. He is the author of the swashbuckling series, The Greatcoats. His books have been translated into 14 different languages and counting. I have Sebastien de Castell. Hi, Sebastien.
Hi, Jen. Thanks for having me.
I am so excited to chat with you today. You have such a crazy imagination from your book series. You have a few book series and they're fantasy, magic, swashbuckling. So I can just tell you've maybe done one or two things in your life that you never thought you would do.
I have. Yeah, the one of the weirdest ones in recent years was that a few years ago, my wife and I were in South Africa. She was at a conference, and I came with her. And then afterwards, we went on a little kind of guided tour. And for some reason that seemed inexplicable to me, the tour guide decided that we all had to stop at this at what is apparently the world's longest commercial bungee jump. It's something like either like 236 meters, which is got to be over 900 feet, off of this massive bridge. And I never bungee jumped in my life. I never wanted to. I've never been an extreme sports person at all. So I had no intention of doing it. And in fact, nobody on this tour wanted to do it except this one guy, this one young guy. He was a really nice guy. I think he was from Saudi Arabia, and he hadn't been talking to a lot of the people there. He was there with his cousin, I think. And he said he really wanted to do it, but he didn't want to be the only one doing it.
Mm.
And so I don't know why, but I guess probably from writing too many swashbuckling novels. I said okay, I'll do it with you. Um, and Christina, my wife, thought I was just nuts because she knows like I'm not into extreme sports at all. And so yeah, so that day we spent all this time like getting fitted for harnesses and then wandering onto this bridge, and just walking down on the span towards the bridge was terrifying. And then they blasted all this super loud party music because they're trying to kind of get you in the mood and get you to not sort of remember where you are and what you're
Hold
about
on.
to do.
I want to stop you for a second. So can we set up the scene a little bit? So was the bridge over a body of water or was it just
Yes.
kind of a canyon?
It's a canyon, in fact, both sides of a canyon into a body of water. Um,
Okay. And so it took you a whole day to kind of get fitted and prepare for this, or maybe half a day. What was everybody else from the tour bus doing while you and your friend, your new best friend,
yeah.
who somehow convinced you to jump off a bridge? Well, you guys
uh,
were getting ready. What did everybody else do?
they were very politely simmering with rage at losing an entire day on this tour. When you go to South Africa and you're going on what's called the garden tour, you're assuming you're going to see lots of interesting wildlife and hopefully get to meet people who live there and see some of their lives. Um, and the idea of a giant bungee jump is just doesn't go into your head because it's not something people in South Africa do all the time. It's not like a cultural artifact of that place.
You didn't sign up for the extreme bungee jump tour. You signed up for the garden tour.
Exactly. So all these other poor people are, some of them came and stood on the bridge to watch. Some just sat in the restaurant. Christina, my wife, came to watch, but she was mostly, just to be there in case it went badly and I died. Um, and so yeah, and so there we are. They built this whole kind of metal apparatus under this massive bridge, and they had these huge speakers in the back, and they have this crew that's working on stuff, and they're all kind of dancing around all the time, which is to make you feel better, but does not remotely make you feel better, because the person who's about to throw you off a bridge, you don't want them idly dancing and dreaming about the future. You kind of want them focused on the present. And it's really interesting because they were so professional about this. Like they were so slick. They have all these cameras in just the right place to capture the moment. And I remember the thing that I never anticipated, because I've never been afraid of heights until the night before I bungee jumped. Because once I knew I was going to do it the night before, all of a sudden I had all these weird panic attacks in the middle of the night of
Oh,
falling off bridges.
so it wasn't like a split second, like on the day of decision. You
No, it was,
you decided the day before that you were gonna. Okay.
yeah, I wish it had been the day of a split decision, because I probably wouldn't have brought all that anxiety with me.
Mhm.
And so once we're sort of standing there on that bridge, I had thought about all of these things, and you sort of prepare yourself. But what I'd forgotten is that when you're going to do a bungee jump, they have to strap your legs together. So when they're taking you to the edge, you're not even in control of your feet. There's two big guys, and they're holding your arms on either side and hopping you to the edge of the bridge. And there's this hilarious moment, because they gave us the video footage afterwards, where they point to a camera up above right before you're going to jump off, and they say, "Look, smile for the camera." And in the video, I can see myself. I'm looking up and I'm smiling at the camera, and I like got this confident grin, and then I look down for the first time, and you can see my face completely drop, like just go from like that, and then they shout bungee, and I had to leap off this bridge, and it was absolutely insane. And there's about 2 seconds of that process that's really fun, which is when you've come down to the full stretch and then you're bouncing up again, because for about 2 seconds it feels like you're flying. and
Mhm.
then and then but once you settle, and it's hard to express how long that rope is that's holding you. Like you're so far down from the bridge, it looks like it's in the sky, that when they that then you have to wait, because they have to reel you up, right? But but even though you're double harnessed, and so I didn't need to worry, it felt like the harness around my legs was slowly slipping. So
Oh.
I was just like pointing my toes, or bending my feet upwards as much as I could to try to feel like I was gripping onto it. So yeah, it was a very odd process to go through on a whim.
Yeah, that sounds terrifying. It's funny because I've been skydiving before, and for some reason, I find bungee jumping more terrifying than skydiving. I don't know why. It doesn't seem to make any sense. Um, but for me, with the bungee jumping, it's kind of like the whiplash at the end that I'm more afraid of like my body kind of jerking. That just seems very unappealing to me. Whereas the skydiving, you're kind of floating in the air and then your chute opens and then it's like a slow, scenic ride down. And
My rationale for it was that there's no way to get it wrong. Like all you have to do is fall.
yeah, that's true.
So yeah, it was definitely an unusual experience though. But it did kind of teach me. It was
Yeah, that's
interesting
what I
because,
want to know. What did it teach you? What what
sorry.
what did you come through the experience with?
So it was interesting because it set me at peace with the fact that I'm not into extreme sports. Because there's always a part of you that's like, the people that do extreme sports absolutely adore them.
Mhm.
And there's a part of you that always thinks, oh, it's just my own fear that's keeping me from this amazing experience that I might really enjoy. And I got the full experience of the bungee jump thing and if you're going to do one, doing the largest commercial bungee jump in the world is probably, the one to do. And, but it wasn't, but I didn't have, it's an interesting sort of thing to say about this, but um, it was great that I didn't love it. It taught me that it's okay. Like you can face your fears, but there wasn't some magical thing I'd been missing in my entire life from
Mhm.
doing that. That it was okay I think sometimes we worry that the things that we love aren't kind of cool enough. We were talking before the show about reading, just sitting there and reading a book and just becoming completely emotionally enraptured in a book.
Mhm.
And so doing this and sort of realizing, yeah, that was fine, but it wasn't this massive life-changing moment. Was kind of life-changing in its own way, because it kind of set me at peace with like, oh, you know what? It's okay to learn to love the things that you love to do, and to not always feel like, oh, because I haven't done this one thing, I've missed out, or I'm completely missing out. That sometimes it's, you have to learn the difference between the things that you would enjoy that you're afraid to try versus the things that aren't really things that appeal to you.
Yes, the things that aren't in your wheelhouse. That's so interesting, especially because now in the age of social media, there's like the term FOMO, fear of missing out. And that's become a really big thing because people only post their Insta life is the perfect version of their life, only the exciting things they do, only the pictures of when they look phenomenal and they're doing the coolest things. And this FOMO is like a real thing now. And, I think it's really amazing when people can just kind of be grounded in, I'm not interested in that. I don't care
Mm-hmm.
how cool it is. I don't care how many people are doing it. It's just not my thing. And I feel like there's so much pressure today. And as you were talking about with your band before we started recording, there's all these different requirements of how to get booked on a gig now, because it's not necessarily about merit. It's about clickbait. And I think it's a dangerous thing. It's a dangerous trap we're falling into because we've become so obsessed with the visual that we're not concerned with the substance anymore or with the merit. And I don't know where we go from there.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. Fear of missing out is exactly the right way to look at it, and I hadn't thought of it in terms of that moment in my life. But I really prize that moment in part because it taught me to see the illusion that is the fear of missing out, and it applies to so many areas. A lot of, I mean, think of all the authors or writers that both of us will have met at various points who are obsessed with being published, right? And that itself is a kind of fear of missing out. And it's interesting because it stops people from actually writing now, because they'll hear, oh, it's impossible to get published, or it's traditional publishing is dying, or it's doing this, and so they won't. And so I often find myself, is when I'm talking to students of writing, or high school students, or just people in general, trying to remind them that all the best parts of writing a novel are accessible to everyone, irrespective of whether the book ever gets published or not. The first
Yeah.
time I wrote a novel, it was a terrible novel that will never go anywhere, but it completely changed my life. It made me more confident. It made me able to handle much larger projects in my head. It got me promoted because I felt that sense of, I know how to do something big and long and hard, that
Yeah.
takes a long time to do. It made other people more interesting to me all of a sudden. So it was like the most valuable book I ever wrote is one that no one will ever read.
And that's the other thing too. I find just in the creative world, we get so precious with our first child, so to speak. And you your first book or your first movie or your first performance or your first painting is not going to be the thing that defines you as an artist. It's not going to be the thing that defines your career. Chances are it's going to get buried and never see the light of day, but going through the process of just doing it and completing it is the most important step of your career. It only comes from experience, getting, and like you said, getting better as a writer. The older we get, the more we've done. We just keep getting better and better and better.
It's interesting, Dave Duncan, who was a fantasy author who had written, I think, more than 50 novels before he died, never wrote a book until he was 53. He
Mm-hmm.
was a chemical engineer. He'd had this whole other life, and then, one day in his 50s, he decides to go and write a book, and launches this career. And that's the beauty. I think that is one of the beauties of the arts, especially, and especially the part that's most worth fighting for is the part of the arts that is about the story or the song or the play, separate from the kind of the veneer of how hot is the songwriter, or how hot is the writer. I remember the first time when I met with my editor at Penguin when my first book, Trader's Blade, was coming out, and we had this meeting, and she started saying, "Oh, and you're very marketable, and that's good." And I was like, "What do you mean marketable? Like no one's ever heard of me." And she said, "No, you look good for an author. Most authors, look pretty look pretty shabby. So we can really use that." And I was like, I don't know that I don't know that readers really care that much what an author looks like.
Yeah.
Um, I think publishers assume readers care in the same way that, if you watch a British television series and you watch an American version of the series, the actors in the American version will often be like these kind of almost perfect kind of models, like
Yeah.
magazine models. And the British actors are not at all. They look more like real people. They're attractive, but they're attractive in their way. And so I think that sometimes we have this perception, and maybe one of the great things about being a novelist and just writing for everyone is it is one of those fields where you can still do it, and people for the most part aren't desperate first to see your promo shot and then read your manuscript. They're still interested in the book.
Exactly. They're more interested in your cover art than they are in your photo. But this is a great segue. So let's get into talking about your books. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the Greatcoat series?
Sure. So it's funny because that was when we were talking before, I was saying that was one of the other I didn't think I would ever kind of stories for me, because around 2006, I had written a novel before, just to get the experience of it, and I'd assumed I was kind of done. I've gotten so much out of that experience that I thought, it's sort of all over. But then there's a thing called the 3-day novel writing contest that comes up every year, I think around September. And I decided, you know what, I'm just going to do it. I had no idea what I was going to write. Most people go in with a plan. They have a detailed outline. They start at 12:01, right after midnight. I went to bed. I got up at 7 a.m. Like still not knowing what book I was going to write. And then this strange thing happened just from throwing myself into it, that for the next 3 days, I wrote 44,000 words in 3 days, which is
Wow.
almost the speed at which I can type. I exercised. I went for a couple of long runs during that time. I had a gig as a musician. I had to learn to sing The Lady in Red at a wedding, of all things. And I slept really well. And yet somehow, I was just kind of unleashed by that period of time. And one of the things I realized during that time was that all of these scenes in this book were scenes that I'd kind of dreamed up, while I was going for runs and listening to music before, just telling myself stories. And a lot of us, we do that. We tell ourselves stories when we're sitting on the bus or the train, and we don't think anything will come of it. But I sat there and I wrote 44,000 words of this book. At the time, I was going to call it Three of Traders, which sounded clever to me, but it wasn't. And I had this great experience. And then a few years later, I thought, you know what, I'm going to take this, I'm going to revise this novel. So I revised it. It more than doubled in length. And it became a book called Trader's Blade, which got me a 4-book deal and launched my career as a novelist.
Okay, that's so freaking amazing. But I want to circle back. So it was a 3-day writing. Was it a challenge? Was it a contest? Did you have to send it in? Did people review it? Or was it just like a personal thing, like doing like a 21-day yoga challenge where nobody's keeping track other than you?
No, there's a formal thing called the 3-day novel writing contest. It happens every year. It's been going for, I think, over 35 years.
Wow.
People all over the world do it. There is a panel that ends up seeing your manuscript. I think I got a little sticker for mine being especially long. That's all they had to say about it. It did not win. It did not win the prize. But that was fine, because the prize would have been a $1,500 publishing deal, as opposed to the 6-figure 4-book deal I ended up getting from a publisher. Which is one of the reasons I don't recommend contests a lot of the time for writers. I'm sure they can be fine for some people, but you realize, once you've kind of been out in the trenches of publishing, that that it is a numbers game sometimes with publishers. And just because a contest doesn't like your work, or a magazine, doesn't mean that a publisher isn't going to come along and say, we can really do something great with this. So
Well,
yeah.
yeah, and that's the thing. It's so subjective, and it's about finding the right fit for my novel, my first editor that somebody put me in touch with just kind of didn't get it. And I was so torn up over the feedback that I didn't look at the manuscript again for almost 2 years, and I was just like, oh, and then I hired another editor, and she re-infused my passion for the project again, because she was my audience too, and things are so subjective in terms of taste, but it's all about vibe, and people either vibe with your work and they don't, and you just need to find the people who are into what you're doing.
And the more distinctive your work, the more distinctive your work, the fewer sort of professional organizations will take to it,
Mm-hmm.
and the more successful it's likely to end up being once someone does.
Yeah.
Um, the Beatles were turned down by everybody until Decca Records decided, okay, we get this.
Yes.
And that's always I think the most challenging part of being an artist in any field is discerning the difference between things that are the way they are because you're not at the top of your game yet, like your craft may or may not be there, versus the things that are the way they are because that's what you actually have to say, and that's what belongs there.
And not trying to please everybody. I've I work with screenwriters all the time with script development. That's because I've been producing for so many years. And it's really amazing when they get too much feedback and they try to please everybody, and the script just kind of falls apart. And I've
Mm-hmm.
seen that happen a few times because they don't have the conviction to stick to the story that they were trying to tell, and they just want to sell it. So they're taking feedback from everybody to try and please every person. And it's like, no, 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 no. Like, you got to figure out what to throw away, and what nuggets of gold are useful to the story that you're telling. You can't tell every story for everybody, and you can't try to please everybody in your work. And just exactly finding the people who vibe with what you're trying to do is all that matters.
It's interesting you say that, because my editor for the Greatcoats books is she's a legend. Her name's Jo Fletcher, and she's edited almost all of the greats out there. And when she started working with me, when her imprint bought the rights to the series, she was very picky about, no, you're not going to share this with writing groups, and you're not going to tell, your wife is allowed to read it. But hardly anybody else. And I was like, why isn't like more perspective better? And said, no, this is you and me, and we're trying to make something great, and I don't need your head filled with everybody's objection because it turns out they don't like the color green, and
Yeah.
you're thinking that the character is the wrong character, and they're just thinking, I don't like green surcoats, that's a terrible kind of coat, you know.
So can you tell us a little bit about the series?
Sure. Yeah. So it's a swashbuckling fantasy series. So it's sometimes been likened to, the Three Musketeers meets Game of Thrones. Although I suppose everything is meets Game of Thrones these days, so that's lost its meaning. It was built on something that I had discovered years ago, reading in history books about something called the Justice's Itinerant, which was in the 12th century in England. They had these traveling judges because you didn't have courts in every small town, and they would go on these circuits, which is in fact where the term circuit court comes from, because they used to have a judge and two lawyers basically travel from town to town to hear cases. And so I wanted to bring that in. I love that idea. I've never been fond of knights because, historically knights were pretty awful, and a lot of fantasy writers like to write about knights. But I thought, well, these traveling judges, what if they had to kind of enforce their verdicts through duels and things like that? And so I ended up having this idea of these very swashbuckling, sword fighting, traveling judges trying to deal with this terrible corruption across their world. And that became the basis of the Greatcoats. And they're called the Greatcoats because they wear these long leather coats that have all these tricks and traps built into them to help them sort of survive. because they have to, travel for, 6 months at a time. And then sometimes it's cold and sometimes it's hot and sometimes somebody's trying to kill them.
Mhm.
Um, and I just fell in love with that sort of idea and that world, and getting to kind of explore themes about idealism and cynicism. And swashbuckling as a sort of subgenre is really fun for that, because it really explores the question of, what can humans do if they dare, you know
Mm.
and so that became the basis of the Greatcoats. And it was a 4-book series that starts with Trader's Blade. And then now we're about to start releasing the second series next year, which has got all of these other orders that sort of grew out of that. One of the lovely things about fantasy worlds is you can just kind of grow things, and you go, well, if there's an order of judges, maybe there's an order of wandering musicians and an order of this. And so you can kind of bring all these different parts of your life in, and add sort of the fantastical elements to it, and then bring that into your narrative and kind of find drama wherever it wants to exist.
And what's the latest book in the Greatcoat series?
So there's going to be a new one coming out in March called Our Lady of Blades, which
Mhm.
is about a young woman who's a duelist, what's called a judicial duelist. But the first one, probably for most people, will be Trader's Blade, and all 4 books in that series are out. So for sometimes people are very nervous now picking up fantasy novels. George R. R. Martin has been a gift to the world in terms of great fantasy, but people have also become really worried about anything that's not finished. So that whole series is complete. The first 4 books are complete, and the new series starts up in March.
Excellent. Well, it's been such a pleasure chatting with you today, Sebastian. Thank you so
Thanks. Me
much
too.
for taking the time.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, so can you tell everyone where they can find you and your books? We'll have the links below as well, but just let us know.
Sure. The best way to find me is at my website, decastell.com. So decastell.com. But if you just search for me on Google, you'll find me really easily. Fortunately, with a name like Sebastien de Castell, you don't get confused with too many other people. I'm also on Twitter, but the best way to reach me is through my website.
Excellent. Well, thank you again for sharing your stories today. It's been really fascinating.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you out there in the interweb for tuning in today. I hope you enjoyed the content. And if you do, don't forget to like and subscribe. And I'd like to challenge you to do something that you never thought you would do. Let us know what it is and where it leads you to in the comments. Have a beautiful day.